Good morning again. Thank you for joining us for the second day of the conference. And before we will start, I would like to say that, or I would like to thank all of you for the nice feedbacks we got yesterday and this morning, and for the new ideas you gave us. And if there's anybody who has additional ideas and additional things that he thinks that Anat or I or anybody else from Haruv needs to know in order to make sure that 2 years from now in the second Haruv International Conference we'll do even a better job, then please feel free to approach me or Anat or anybody else from Haruv here from the organizing committee. We are always looking for new ways and new ideas how to do a better job in the future. And from that I'm jumping into the great pleasure I have today. And you know, in conferences and in my work as the director of the Haruv Institute and in other places, sometimes you have the rare opportunity of getting the honor to present good personal friends. And while I have a lot of friends and a lot of colleagues, the two speakers today are regarded by me, and hopefully by them also, as way beyond just professional colleagues, but also good personal friends and family friends. And it don't take this against them. But on the contrary, I think we have a great privilege to get a perspective today on the topic of child maltreatment in a multicultural perspective and in a more than one perspective. And we will start by the first speaker. I don't think I need to present Professor Jill Korbin too much in a length, but Jill is a professor and the associate dean of social sciences in Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland. And she's probably the leader or the leading researcher in the world on multiculturalism and child maltreatment. As we used to say, she is the one who wrote the book on multiculturalism and child maltreatment. And it's a great pleasure to have her here again in Israel. It's not her first time and not the last time that she's coming to Israel. But it's a great pleasure to have her here today and address all of us and talk about multiculturalism and child maltreatment. Jill, please.
Okay, well, thank you all very much for having me. And Asher is right. He is a very close friend, and I'm very lucky. He keeps inviting me back. So I'm very happy to be here and want to thank the Haruv and Asher and Anat for the Young Researchers Conference she organized, and they're some of our students. Today, I'd like to talk with you a bit about multiculturalism and cultural pluralism in child maltreatment and what some of the challenges and opportunities are. And I'm very happy to be sharing the morning with Sabina, who's also become a good friend. Asher brings together lots of people in many good ways. The clicker is on the left side. We're in Israel. I'm sorry. Okay, so children around the world live in many different contexts with a lot of implications for child maltreatment. And some of you may have seen the movie Babies, and this was a film that just followed young children in Mongolia, Botswana, San Francisco, and Tokyo to see what their different lifestyles were. And it's a very nice film if you haven't seen it, and I'm not supposed to give him too much credit, but Yochai made this slide for me, and I keep using it again and again. And it shows you how different babies and how different child-rearing is around the world. So when we showed it in the United States, we had a screening where people were very upset because the little girl from Botswana was putting her hands in the dirt and then in her mouth. But the little girl from San Francisco on the bottom was crawling around an airport with her hands on the floor. So dirt is all relative. So keep that in mind as we talk. So there's an enormous range of diversity in childhood and adolescence around the world. And there's also substantial inequality that we need to pay attention to in the experience of childhood and adolescence. And this is important to keep in mind when we think about well-being and child maltreatment. And why do we have to pay attention to culture? After being at the workshop, and I heard so many good talks yesterday from the Nevet group and from many others, that we need to pay attention to culture, because unless we understand why and under what circumstances child maltreatment occurs, we're not going to do a good job at preventing it, and we're not going to be able to work with the populations unless we understand maltreatment from their perspective. So we have to understand from their perspective if we want to have any real and lasting impact in really making a difference in child maltreatment. And so I look to some of you younger researchers who are going to make great progress in this area. So in 2000, our Institute of Medicine and National Research Council did a survey of all of the child development literature, which I'm sure was biased towards us, you'll see in a minute, but they still said in this review that culture influences every aspect of human development, and it's reflected in child rearing beliefs and practices designed to promote healthy adaptation, and went on to say that given how important it is on the daily lives of children, the relative disregard for culture in most of the literature is really quite striking and important. So we're waiting for them to redo this study. It hasn't happened yet. They haven't gotten the funding. So what is culture? Sometimes people like to say, oh, there are too many definitions. You can't have a definition of culture. Well, I disagree. It's just hard to define, but you can define it and you can measure it. So these are some things that my colleagues and I generally think of when we think of culture. So it's shared, but it's shared differentially. Adults and children, men and women, it's shared differentially. It's multivocal. There are many perspectives on culture, many voices. It's learned, but as it's learned, each group of young people changes the culture a little bit. So it's like a moving target. And so culture itself is dynamic and it's always changing, which means that studying culture, of course, is a challenge. It can be seen in the behaviors and activities of everyday life. It's held in the mind as cognitive models and cultural scripts, but there's not a recipe or a catalog to go look up what to do with a specific group without understanding them from their perspective. So culture also is so important because it crosses all the ecological levels that we're interested in. It provides what anthropologists call the settings or the context, and it influences the people with whom the child is involved, the activities in which the child engages, the daily routines, parental scripts, goals for child development, and also sets the stage for the challenges and opportunities that children face. There's diversity within any cultural group, and when Yochai was with us in Cleveland, he helped us to add this perspective on intersectionality, that there are many facets of being a member of a culture. It's not so simple. You're not just a female, you're not just a certain age, but these things work together. You're a certain class, your race or your ethnicity. And so there's enormous variability within culture that we all need to pay attention to. But our knowledge about human development is very limited because it's based on samples that are pretty much drawn from less than 10% of the world's children who live in Eurocentric countries. So there have been reviews of this before, but one that got particular attention was because they called us the weirdest people in the world. So Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic is where most of the child development and child rearing literature comes from. And this is from a paper called The Weirdest People in the World. And we can give you both a short and a long version of it if you want. So, quickly, 96% of the samples in human development research come from these weird countries. 68% are from the United States, and 70% are from psychology undergraduates, which what it means to us is when you take a psychology class as an undergraduate, you have to sign up for a certain number of hours of experiments to pass the course. I don't know if you do that to your students here, but we all have to, we had to sign up to do these experiments in the literature. So 70% of those students, and these are about 16% of the countries of the world's population, a little bit less than 10% of the population of children. So our knowledge about human development is a little skewed, a lot skewed, you could say, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. So one of the tensions, we've been talking about tensions in working with child maltreatment. So one of the tensions in approaches to culture and child maltreatment is between cultural pluralism and universal standards. And it's an uncomfortable tension, and we'll talk about it a bit because it's very difficult to try and resolve being in a human services field and dealing with children. So I want to talk a little bit about these two approaches, whether they're really mutually exclusive or complementary, and how we start to try and bridge some of this gap. So a term that is coming to be used more is this idea of cultural pluralism. And it takes into account the diversity of childhoods around the world in light of or in face of an international agenda that promotes really a universal standard for children's well-being and child maltreatment. But the cultural pathways in which human development occurs is probably the most important influence shaping developmental outcomes. How functions are carried out in different cultural communities varies, and as I'm going to talk about a little bit, we need to enhance our research agenda to be better at understanding how this has an impact. So for example, all societies protect children. They have to protect their children as they're growing up, but how and from what may vary. So in some places in the world, your big concern is keeping your child from rolling into the fire at night while you're sleeping, and in other places it's protecting your child from pedophiles on the street. So we need to have a context-informed idea about cultural pluralism. So in child maltreatment, we've looked at levels of definition. There are cultural differences in how groups define child maltreatment, and some excellent papers here talked about it if you looked at the program, and we can come back to this later. There are always within cultural differences, and this may be where you can see what's defined as maltreatment by the group in question, if you look at what their definition is and who violates those standards. And then I like to include societal abuse and neglect of children because we have national policies that do not act in the best interests of children, and they sometimes get confused with culture, but they really have to do with public policies. In the US, we have in some cities a fourth of our children, up to a fourth of our young children living below the poverty line. So how do you draw this line between neglect and poverty? So it's just, it's not cultural. You need to think about where some of these ideas are coming from. Also, all cultural differences aren't the same. Just because we see that there are differences in child rearing practices and parental goals, some cultural practices may have a potential for harm. They may actually put children at some risk. So just because they're cultural doesn't mean cultures don't change. The idea of spare the rod and spoil the child has changed over time in the United States, where now you're not supposed to use physical punishment either. Cultural practices in the context of change is another kind of cultural difference. Something may work really well in the indigenous population, like siblings taking care of younger siblings may work well in a rural or remote village, but when you move into a city, it can become very dangerous with cars on the road, substandard housing. And then finally, things can be misinterpreted or misrepresented as culture when they're really not. They're really aberrant behaviors that some members of a culture practice, and so you then say that this is all cultural. This does get me kind of exercised, because then you're not really either understanding culture or protecting children. So let's look now, that was cultural pluralism. Now let's look at these universalism, and we only need to go as far as the UNCRC, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and Article 19, where we protect children from all forms of abuse, neglect, exploitation, and cruelty, including the rights to special protection in difficult times, and abuse in the criminal justice system. And so this is the whole text of it. And so you see that the convention both says that it allows for national differences, but it says we don't want children to experience any violence. And so it doesn't exactly allow for a lot of latitude, because violence is interpreted as any kind of physical discipline or assault on a child. So when you think about cultural pluralism, you're thinking about it in the face of this idea that there's a universal standard for child well-being. And we are kind of in this dilemma, because we want to do the best we can for children, but we also want to allow for the fact that cultures may do things differently. So how do we start to address this tension between pluralism and universalism? And we've spent many of us have spent many decades trying to figure this out. And I think that we have to move towards empirical evidence about how culture influences child maltreatment. And by empirical evidence, I mean all kinds of evidence, qualitative, quantitative, and mixed methods kinds of research. And I've heard all of that during the workshop so far. I've heard some really excellent talks here. So, we have knowledge about diversity in cultural pathways. We have a lot of documentation that there are differences in how people raise and punish and take care of children, particularly in the anthropological and the ethnographic literature. But what we don't have is we don't have really good evidence on what the outcomes of these diverse pathways are. They're less well understood. We don't understand how these variations really play out in terms of children's subjective well-being, or their development, or in maltreatment, with some important exceptions, like Dr. Keller, who's here, is doing some really important work on attachment, and others are doing important work in this area. Muhammad, who's also here, has importantly added to this literature of understanding how these cultural factors play out. So we know there's diversity, but we don't know the outcomes. And so then we're limited to just saying, well, they grow up okay, so it must be okay, but that's not a good enough argument when we're thinking about children's well-being and maltreatment. Now, on the other side, particularly in the psychological literature, and particularly from weird societies, child outcomes have been very well studied. So we know that there are consequences of certain kinds of punishment. We know a lot about what promotes empathy. We know what promotes difficult outcomes, but we don't really know how these outcomes work across the cultural pathways leading to these outcomes. So this pushes us back towards the universalistic kind of view of saying, well, we know that children are better off if they experience a certain kind of child care, but we know it from these so-called weird societies. So we have to figure out better how this generalizes to other cultural contexts. So we have a disconnect. We know about cultural differences, but not about their outcomes. We know about developmental outcomes, but not how they generalize to other cultures beyond those in which they were studied. And so now the task really becomes how to put them together. So this is a difficult task on its own, but it's really difficult in child maltreatment because both culture and child maltreatment are highly sensitive issues. So you're taking two difficult issues and you're like pushing them together, and it becomes even harder to say to a group of people, well, just because you do it this way, maybe that's not the best outcome, because we don't really know. So the field, for example, has spent a lot of time, at least in the US, worrying about spanking and less about emotional maltreatment that may leave different consequences. So I'm not advocating physical punishment. I'm just saying we need to think about what the outcomes are and have some evidence. So this is what we want to know. We want to know this question mark in the middle. What leads from culture to child maltreatment, and how does this really work? We really need to know more about how it works. So Yochai and Jim and I started out last year also doing a review of the literature in 3 journals. You can see they're Western-oriented journals, but they're journals that have been used for past reviews. And we're trying to look at this question mark, that was in the middle of the last slide, and how the literature has gone about looking at this. So we came up with 5 different approaches looking at the literature, and I'm going to talk about them for just a few minutes. So one approach has been to look at similarities and differences between populations. I'll come back to these in a minute. A second has been to look to offer cultural explanations, but after the fact. A third has been to suggest a cultural hypothesis, but then you don't test it, you just suggest it. You say, maybe this is why. A fourth is to look at a culturally based explanation or causal explanation, and test it, but then you don't measure culture. You just say, oh, there's a difference between the populations. And the final approach is to look at culturally based explanations that you propose, test, and you measure culture. So let me just go through these more quickly, because these 5 approaches are not in a hierarchy. Different kinds of research have different kinds of benefits and help move the field forward. So in approach 1, which were about 14% of the articles we looked at, you would say something like there's more child abuse in one group, cultural group A than cultural group B. So this alerts us, and it alerts the field to the reality that there are cultural differences or some kind of differences going on between these populations in incidence and prevalence. But it doesn't help you get to why. But that's not to say it's not valuable, because sometimes we need to know, are there differences between populations before you can move to the next step. And the second approach we looked at in these articles is where there's an explanation offered after the fact. So if you say that there's more abuse in group A than in group B, and it's because of this factor, like the belief in physical punishment, I just picked an example, it points to the reality that culture has an influence on child maltreatment, but the explanation is still a hypothesis. You're not much further ahead because you've proposed it after the fact. You're trying to explain why you saw that difference. So this is good for hypothesis generating, but you haven't really figured out what the cause is yet. The third approach that we saw is where you would say that there's more child abuse in one group than another, and it's because of a value on physical punishment, just as an example. So it does push the field. You make a hypothesis, you say you're going to test it, but some of these articles just didn't test whether that was really the cultural variable that they were looking at. So it pushes the field towards having hypotheses, but we don't really know. So it's good for suggesting, but it doesn't get us there. There are just 2 more. So in the fourth approach, we found a lot of papers where The authors could conclude that there was more abuse in one group than the other, and it was because people in one group expressed a stronger belief in whatever the cultural variable is you were studying. And this then alerts us to the importance of what's the mechanism or the process by which culture works and influences child maltreatment. Culture in all its complexity, not simple culture. But in this group of papers, culture wasn't measured. So it was maybe African Americans and whites, but we weren't really sure what it was about the culture that would make such a difference. And in the final group of papers, or the approach that we looked at, there was actually a measuring of both the process, that there's more in Group A than in cultural Group B, because of values that were actually measured or beliefs favoring something. And in the best possible case, you would be able to show variability within a culture so that stronger adherence to a value or belief should help you explain the behavior more fully. So, in full disclosure and fairness, about half of these papers were from the US because of the journals we selected, but these were the journals that were used in past reviews, and we wanted to be able to compare them. Past reviews have been helpful in showing that culture is increasingly recognized in the literature. And so our point in this review was not to say one is good, one is bad, but to look at different ways that culture is considered and to think about how to push the field forward by measuring culture in meaningful ways and adding to the literature. And so, like Asher said yesterday, we're looking to you, to younger researchers, to do a better job, to think about how to do some of these difficult things. So the last thing I want to just quickly talk about, because Ilan talked yesterday about disproportionality some, I wanted to just give you an example from our home city of Cleveland to show you how serious this disproportionality or disparity can be, and why it makes it so important that we consider cultural kinds of issues in explaining why this happens. So, as all of you know, that disproportionality means that there are differences in the percentage of children in a given group as compared to their percentage in the population as a whole, and disparity is differences in the percentage of children due to inequities. So they overlap quite a bit, but they do mean different phenomena. So it's been widely documented in the US population, but not without controversy. There's a literature about whether disproportionality is because of poverty, if it's because of stress, and this has been around for at least 4 decades. This question of, is it stress, is it being more recognized because you're a poor population? And it's not the only source of disproportionality, and it's not unique to the US. As Ilan said yesterday, in Australia, in many parts of the world, in the Pacific, there's disproportionality in cultural and indigenous groups being overrepresented. So let me show you Cleveland. So this is a study that our colleagues did in Cleveland more than a decade ago, but they showed that in the left-hand side, these are cross-sectional reports. This is just, incidence. And if you look at the disproportionality in reports, you see that African Americans are reported more than whites or European Americans. But they also took a life table approach, and this is what is stunning and striking to us, that half of the African American population in Cleveland experienced a report of child maltreatment sometime before they were 10. So not only what does this do to the child and the family, but what does this say about the cultural community in which they live and how they respond to social services. And substantiated, indicated, you can also see this disparity that African Americans, about 1/3 of all children before they're 10, are going to have a substantiated report and be involved with child welfare services. So I just wanted to point this out as being another one of these examples where we know that there's this difference, and now it's really our responsibility and our obligation to the children and the families and the communities that we work with to try and figure out why and how this is happening and what we can do at different stages of the process to try and resolve this issue of cultural differences in maltreatment. So, toda, I thank you, and